So welcome to today's lesson, and I think we need to look at the factors that determine the size of the national income. So last time we looked at the difficulties in measuring the national income. So we discussed some of the difficulties that economists encounter while trying to measure the national income. We mentioned some of the difficulties like the incomplete information. We also discussed about the danger of double counting. We also mentioned unpaid services. So there are unpaid services that are not captured in the national income. Also, depreciation is difficult to estimate, but the figure that may be used as a depreciation may not be correct value. So inventory valuation can also be a problem when determining the size of the national income. And then we have a problem with inflation, which is the change in the value of money. This normally affects the size of national income. Now today we want to look at the factors determining the size of national income. There is quite a number of factors that determine the size of the national income. The first one is the stock of factors of production. So the size of the national income is actually determined by the stock of the factors of production. This one is in terms of both the quality and the quantity. So those countries that are privileged to have high quantity of the factors of production, and of course the quality tends to have high national income or a high level of what the national income. So when you talk about the factors of production, we mean land, labor. We also have other factors that are used in the national income statistics. So we have natural resources. They can also determine the size of the national income. So when you talk about land, you can have a large size of what? Land, but that may not be able to contribute to higher national income if that land is not fertile. In terms of labor, we also look at the required skills. So you can have plenty of what? Labor, but the required skills are not available. That means that the national income will not be as big as expected. So availability of goods, of good or bad infrastructure. So infrastructure is also key in determining the size of the national income. So if you look at the developed countries, they have very good infrastructure. And that's why their national income is always higher than the developing countries. So the developing countries have very poor infrastructure. That's why their level of income is also lower. Now, the other factor that determines the size of the national income is the state of technological knowledge. So whether the know-how or not, and whether the technology is appropriate. So technology is key to determining the size of the national income. Those countries that are characterized with better technology, so they tend to have a high level of national income. Because technology plays a very big role in production and of course in providing services. So which of course contributes to a higher level of national income. And we also have participation rate. So that is what we refer to as labor force participation. Countries that are developed, they have a high level of labor force participation than developing countries. If you want to compare the labor force participation rate, look at the employment or unemployment levels. In developed countries, the unemployment level is very low compared to developing countries. So the proportion of economically active group compared to the general population is what we refer to as the participation rate. So where this participation rate is high, definitely to translate into a higher national income. We also have another factor, which is political stability. So political stability also determines the level or the size of the national income. So if the country is politically stable, so it encourages more economic activities to take place. And of course, that contributes to higher national income. Look at those countries that are characterized by political instability. So most of the economic activities don't take place because of the political instability. Of course, that means that they have a lower national income. Now, what are the uses of the national income? So there are quite a number of uses of the national income, and maybe you can mention a few. Now, the national income accounting highlights information about the size of various sectors in the economy. So when we are computing the national income, the contribution of each sector to the national income is accounted for. And by looking at the statistics from each sector, so you can determine or you can tell the size of each sector in the economy. We have the agricultural sector, we have manufacturing, etc. And what it contributes to the national income can be determined. So this information is important because it guides investment. So if you want to invest, you need to know which sector of the economy that can generate a high level of what returns, which sector is stagnating, etc. The national income accounting also highlights information about economic performance of the economy over time. So you have discussed or you have heard severally about economic growth. So how do we measure economic growth? So the economic growth is simply measured through the national income accounting system. So if the national income increases over time, cause accounting for inflation, it means that we are experiencing economic growth over time. So you can only tell that through the national income statistics. So when we measure the annual gross domestic product or the GDP over time, if there is an increase of the GDP over time, then we have economic growth. So the national income statistics or accounting can also be an indicator of structural changes. So structural change is simply a transformation in the economy. So for example, when the country develops, so we move from the agriculture to manufacturing, and then from manufacturing to the service sector. So in developed countries, manufacturing and the service sector contributes a greater proportion of the gross national product. That is a structural transformation. So by looking at the national income statistics, you can tell whether the economy has gone through a structural transformation or not, simply by looking at the contribution of each sector to the national income statistics. Now, we need to look at another important concept, which is the circular flow of income. We have discussed what is the national income, how do we measure the national income, what determines the size of the national income, of course, uses of the national income statistics. So, what is a circular flow of income? Now, the circular flow model describes the flow of resources, products, and income among economic factors. Now, the income that is earned by the household is spent on goods and services from farms. Now, the farms also spends their resources on hiring labor from the households, and they pay for those services that they receive, or they pay for the labor services that they receive from the household. Now, for simplicity purposes, if we consider an economy with two actors, so consider a very simple economy that has two actors. These two actors is the household and the farms. So these farms and the households, they interact in a circular pattern, so which can be shown from the diagram. Now the households and the farms, they interact through two markets. So we have the product market, and we also have the resources market. But the resources market is the factor market. Now, the households normally buy goods or services in the product market. They buy goods or services in the product market, and the farms sell their goods or services in the product market. So in the product market, the farms and the households interact. But the farms and the households also interact through the the resources market or the factor market. Farms sell their goods and services in the product market, and the households also buy goods and services in the product market. Now the household sells their labor services in the factor market, and the farms also buy their factors of production in the factor market. And of course, the farms pay the household for the labor services in the factor markets. So the income now moves in a circular what pattern. The farms, they pay for factor services to the households. So the household pay for goods and services in the product market. So which means the income moves to the farms. So that simply means the income moves in a circular manner. That is what we refer to as the circular flow of income. So in this case, we are considering a simple economy. So a simple economy is a closed economy with only two actors. So in this case, there is no government and there is no external economy. So in that simple model, the households supply resources. These resources can be land, labor, capital, entrepreneurial skill, to the resource market or the factor market, and they receive earnings for those resources. So if you have land, somebody hires that land from you, he pays rent. Labor, you are paid wages. Capital, there is interest. And of course, entrepreneurial skills, you get the profits. Now, the demand for goods and services from the product market make payments for those goods and services using incomes they receive. So whatever you receive by selling the factors of production, you use it to buy the goods and services from the product market. Now for farms, the farms demand resources for the production of goods and services. And this is obtained from the resource markets or the factor markets. Now, the supply of goods and services, the product markets, is done by the farms. So once they produce, they sell those goods and services in the product markets. Now the products and services flow in a counterclockwise direction, while payments for these items flow in the opposite direction. So you can see in the circular flow of income. So check the diagram and see. So we have the clockwise and anti-clockwise what? Movement. So if you look at the household, from the household, the income that is earned by selling goods and by selling their labor services is spent in the labor markets to buy goods and services that are provided by farms. So there is a anti-clockwise movement of income. Now we move to, so if you look at the above diagram, it assumes an economy with no government and it does not participate in foreign trade. But if you look at most of the economies that we have, not even most, all the economies that we have, they have governments and they also have the foreign sector. So countries trade with one another and the government also actively participates in economic activities. Thus, in such an economy, there are four factors. We have households, we have farms, governments, and the outside world. So other than being only resource and product markets, we also have the money markets, the economy. So if we look at a more elaborate circular flow model, we will include these other sectors that we have mentioned. That is the government and the foreign sector. So you can have a more detailed circular flow of income. So you need to look at it carefully and see how income flows from households. We have the government, we have farms, and the rest of the world. So you also have the money market. Now, from the farms, if we start from the farms, so the farms, there is a flow of money from farms to the household. And from the household, we have savings. This household saves in the money market. You do your savings in the money market. And from the money market, you can borrow for consumption. That moves to the farms again. So if you borrow for consumption, whatever you have borrowed is spent on the goods and services that are produced by farms. So we also have external sector. That is from the rest of the world. Now the external sector, if you can see the external sector, we have M. M refers to imports. So we spend some of our money to import goods and services from outside the country. So those are resources that are taken away from the country or from the circular flow of income. We also have exports. So the exports, those are resources that are brought in the country. When you export your goods outside the country, you are paid for money. And that money joins the circular flow of income. Now we have the government. Now the income that is earned from farms, part of the income is paid as taxes to the government. So from the farms pay taxes, and of course before the household gets the disposable income, they should have paid taxes to the government. Now the government also makes some transfer payments. So transfer payments is simply payments that are made to the citizens. It can be in terms of the social security, retirement benefits, etc. So they are paid to the household. Now from the money market, so we said the household saves in the money market. So from the money market, investment is made. So from the investment, of course, you get your returns, which again joins the income that you consume. Now, the government can also borrow from the money market to spend. So the money market can be accessed by the government and farms and also the household. You can borrow, invest. The government can also borrow from the money market. So the government also purchases goods and services from farms and the rest of the world. So if you look at this diagram, so the money simply moves in a circular flow. Now, if you look at the diagram critically, we have leakages and injections to the circular flow of income. Leakages simply implies that there is money that escapes from the circular flow of income. So if you look at taxes, for example, look at taxes. So taxes simply escapes from the circular flow of income. Look at savings. Whatever you save, you don't spend it. So it escapes from the circular flow of income. And also look at the imports. So the money you spend for imports, you are paying somebody outside the country. So it acts as leakages from the circular flow of income. We also have injections to the circular flow of income. So the injections we have investment. We look at investment I, it joins the circular flow of income here. So you look at the government spending. So the government spending is an injection, the circular flow of income. So we also have transfer payments. The transfer payments also joins the circular flow of income, and also we have exports. So these are injections to the circular flow of income. Now the leakages refers to any diversion of aggregate income from the domestic spending. So we have withdrawals from the circular flow of income. That's what we refer to as leakages. And the leakages, I've said, they include savings, taxes, and imports. They simply withdraw resources from the circular flow of income. So the injections refers to any payment of income other than from farms or any other spending by domestic households on the economy, including investments, the government purchases, transfer payments, and exports. So these are examples of injections. We have the national income and the social welfare. Now we can look at the national income and the social welfare. Now, does it make any change that the national income, does it really affect the welfare? Now, we have looked at the per capita income previously, and we normally use the per capita income to measure the level of welfare. Now, the per capita income that we normally rely to measure the welfare is not a good measure because of limitations of now some of the limitations of using per capita income as a measure of social welfare include: one, it doesn't look at the distribution of income in the economy. So we said that the per capita income, you simply take the total income in the economy divided by the total population. So if you take that, so this one does not take into account the distribution of income. So it simply assumes that the income is evenly distributed, which is false. Therefore, we cannot rely so much on the per capita income to measure the social welfare of people. Now, the other issue is that an increase in the national income would be due to increase in the number of working hours, which implies that people don't have leisure time, which adversely affected their health conditions. So if you spend more time working, that will lead to an increase in the national income. But that does not mean that your social welfare has increased, because you have sacrificed your leisure time, which you need for social activities and exercise, and of course this will affect your health. Therefore, it's not a good measure of the social welfare. Now, this per capita income is simply a measure of production and consumption, and not a measure of welfare of people. So the per capita income is computed by looking at the production Now, let me repeat on what we were discussing before we got a technical problem. We were discussing about consumption, savings, and investment. So the first part of that is the consumption function. And we have consumption function given as alpha, that is C is equal to alpha y. And I said that what that consumption function communicates. So it simply shows that consumption is an increasing function of income. So from your linear equations and functions that you have done in mathematics, so you understand or you can interpret what is A and what is beta. Now, that means that consumption increases as income increases. Now, the marginal increase in consumption is given by beta, which is less than the increase in income. So that means beta is less than 1. So if income increases by 1 unit, then consumption increases by a figure that is less than 1 unit. Now, the marginal increase in consumption resulting from an increase in income is what we refer to as the marginal propensity to consume. That is the MPC. So beta is referred to as the MPC. So the marginal propensity to consume is simply the change in consumption arising from a unit change in income. That is represented by beta. Now, if we look at the consumption function again, it's made up of two parts. We have alpha, and there is the consumption part, which is represented by beta y. If we look at beta, we also have the other part, which is beta y. Now, the autonomous part of consumption, which is alpha, does not depend on the size of disposable income. That is what we refer to as the independent what or autonomous consumption. It does not depend on the level of income. Now, since you are consumers, now there is people who are unemployed. They don't have any source of income, but they are consuming. So this consumption can be, you can borrow money and spend, and it's what we refer to as autonomous consumption. So that is consumption when the income is actually zero. Now there is consumption at zero income because the consumption also depends on other factors. So the other factors we can refer to as transfer payments. Maybe the government is supporting you, and of course, maybe you had saved earlier. You are now consuming your savings. So that autonomous consumption is made, or it's part of the transfer payments and the savings that you may have saved earlier. So if we draw that line, that equation, this is what we'll have. So the consumption function, this is the consumption function. So alpha here is the autonomous consumption. It does not depend on the level of what? Income. So this part here, so that is the autonomous consumption. And it does not depend on the level of income. So the other part that depends on the level of income, you can see as income increases, consumption also increases. We have the average propensity to consume, that is what we refer to as the APC, and the APC is the proportion of disposable income that is spent on consumption. So the APC, or the average propensity to consume, is given by by consumption divided by income. So from the above consumption function, so if you divide the consumption function by income, you get the average propensity to consume. That's what you get as the APC. Now the MPC is simply the change in consumption over the change in income. That is what we refer to as the MPC. It is represented by that questions. That is a simple savings function that we have discussed. So it is important that you note the autonomous consumption, and also you note the marginal propensity to consume, that is the MPC. Because as we move forward, we are going to use them somewhere in computations of the national income. Of course, when we will be dealing with the multiplier issues. So you need to know what is the marginal propensity to consume, and you should be able to compute it. And also the autonomous consumption, you need to understand what they represent. So we can also have a look at the savings function. I said the savings function describes the total amount of savings at each level of disposable income. Remember that savings is the difference between disposable income and the consumption. So what you don't consume, you save it. So the difference between your income and the consumption is what we refer to as the savings. So if we are given this consumption function, we can derive the savings function. I've said that the savings function is simply the difference between consumption and the disposable income. So if we have a simple consumption function as given above, then the savings is simply the income minus what? Consumption. So this is the consumption part. So the savings will be represented by this part here, which is alpha, that is negative alpha plus y minus beta y. So that simply means that the savings function is represented by this. So this is the savings function. You simply rearrange the consumption function that you have. We have said that savings is the difference between the disposable income and consumption. So y simply represents the income, or the disposable income. So if you draw the savings function, so it will look like this. So this is the savings function. So you can see this upward sloping. So we don't have autonomous savings. That's why this part is negative. So we have savings on the vertical axis, and then we have income on the horizontal axis. Now, if you look at that savings function, so the savings function is upward sloping. So implying that savings is an increasing function of income. So if income increases, so saving is also likely to increase. Now the slope of the savings function is what we refer to as the marginal propensity to save, that is MPS. So the marginal propensity to save is the change in savings resulting from a change in personal disposable income. That's a unit change in personal disposable income. And the average propensity to save, that is the APS. So the APS is the proportionate disposable income that is saved, which is simply savings over income, which implies that income increases and savings decreases, and vice versa. So more importantly, you need to understand the relationship between the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save. This equation here is very important. So the marginal propensity to save is simply 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. In other words, the marginal propensity to save plus the marginal propensity to consume should add up to 1. That is what that implies. Now, we can look at income as a major determinant of consumption. So we said earlier that consumption is an increasing function of income, which means that as income increases, consumption also increases. Now, the Keynesian consumption theory suggests that consumption is linearly dependent on income, so that in the long run, we have consumption function given as alpha plus beta y. Now, in the Keynesian theory, the savings is a function of income. We have seen that savings also depends on the level of income, while investment is a function of interest rates. Now, the investment depends on the level of interest rates prevailing in the economy. Now, in the long run, it's assumed that consumption entirely depends on income. So in the long run, consumption depends on the level of income. That means that as income increases, the autonomous part of consumption disappears. So the autonomous part disappears so that consumption purely depends on the level of income. That is in the long run. So if you look at that diagram, so this is C, consumption. So we have income here. So this one is a function of what? Now, this is simply a function of income. That is what I mean. I said consumption is simply a function of income. That's what I'm trying to communicate. It purely depends on income. So this is consumption on your vertical axis. Now, in the classical economics, savings is a function of the interest rate. That is, in the classical economics, the savings depends on the level of interest rate. So it's assumed that depending on the interest rate in the commercial banks, the household decides how much to save before devoting the balance to consumption. So the savings, it depends on the interest rates prevailing in the economy. So savings is an increasing function of the interest rate. You can see. So if the interest rate increases, so people will be prompted to save more. In the Keynesian economics, now while the classical economics emphasize the consumption function as a function of interest rates, so the Keynesian economics emphasizes that income is the main determinant of consumption, and therefore we can draw the following inferences. One, that consumption is a stable function of real income. Consumption is a stable function of real income. And in this case, you need to distinguish between the real and the nominal income. So consumption simply increases as income increases, but not as much as the increase in income. So we have talked about the marginal propensity to consume. Consumption increases, but not as much as the increase in income. So if income increases by 1 unit, then consumption increases by a figure that is less than 1 unit. That is what that point means. So the short-run marginal propensity to consume is less than the long-run marginal propensity to consume. In the long run, the proportion of income which is saved as real income increases, and therefore the APC, that is the average propensity to consume, will increase with income. That is what that point means.